No one saw where she came from, or where she was going, only that she always appeared right on time. The towns had forgotten their stories, their pain buried under years of silence and unopened letters. But wherever she sat, old wounds quietly unlocked themselves like doors long sealed by shame and regret. She never spoke, never demanded. Her only gift was stillness, and the permission it gave others to face what hurt. People didn't know they were waiting, not until her quiet eyes showed them how. She never healed them. They healed because she waited while they found the way themselves. Nora, mother who lost her daughter to pride, couldn't yet know that Maggie's unsent letter would stitch their family back together. Blind woodworker Victor, lost without his craft, had no idea that his unfinished cabinet would find new life beneath trembling fingers guided by memory. Orphan lighthouse daughter Emily, searching for her father, certainly had no idea that her father's letter lay waiting beneath rotting floorboards. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. It warms my heart to see how far these stories travel. And if you enjoy heartfelt tales like this one, don't forget to subscribe. There's more to come. Now, let's begin. It all started with the kind of morning that doesn't announce itself, the kind that simply arrives like it's always been there. The sun climbed slowly over the empty highway, spilling soft orange light across cracked asphalt, as if trying to remember how to wake up this forgotten place called Whitlow Pass. There weren't many left to greet the morning in that town. No grand opening hours, no crowded bus stops, no farmers unloading crates into waiting trucks. Only the slow wind rattling faded window blinds and the dry hum of neon signs that hadn't lit up properly in over a decade. But on this particular morning, something different moved along that road, not a car or a man, but a dog. She was not young anymore. Her coat carried streaks of silver across the black saddle of her back, and her eyes, though sharp, reflected years that weighed heavier than her thin frame suggested. Her name was Sable, though few, if any, now knew it, and she walked as if led not by instinct or hunger, but by the memory of something unfinished. The leather collar around her neck hung loose, the brass nameplate nearly rubbed smooth by time and distance, but still faintly bearing the name of a man who was no longer waiting. She did not hurry. Her paws moved with a rhythm that neither questioned the journey nor feared the destination, as though each step was guided by something far older than roads or maps. The wind shifted as she crossed into the heart of Whitlow Pass, carrying the scent of old coffee, cracked linoleum, and a name that still hung above the diner in chipped, flaking paint, Agnes Place, since 1952. Inside that diner, a woman sat by the front window, staring out as she had every morning for the last 30 years. Agnes Dorsey, 81 years old, wore the same pale blue cardigan and soft cotton dress she always wore when waiting. Though the tables sat empty and no orders rang through the kitchen anymore, she still unlocked the door each day at 6, polished the counter, and set 2 cups of coffee, one for herself and one for the brother who never came home. Her brother Leonard had vanished in 1957, a hitchhiker who caught the wrong ride on the wrong road, leaving only postcards with no return address and the ache of unanswered questions. The sheriff's department called it cold long ago, but Agnes called it unfinished. As the sun crept higher, Sable stopped in front of the wide glass window, her reflection briefly blending with Agnes's tired face. The old woman's breath caught slightly, her thin fingers trembling around the porcelain handle of her untouched coffee mug. There was something in those eyes, not fear, not surprise, but recognition, like seeing an old photograph come to life. Sable sat without command, folding her legs beneath her like a statue planted by fate. For minutes they simply stared at one another, 2 creatures from different species bound by the same quiet kind of waiting. Finally, Agnes stood, her joints cracking softly beneath the weight of years, and shuffled toward the door. The bell above the door jingled, sharp at first, then fading into soft echoes swallowed by the empty street. She stepped out onto the porch, the wind tugging lightly at the hem of her dress, and lowered herself slowly onto the wooden bench. The dog didn't flinch. "You know, girl," Agnes said gently, her voice worn but steady, "I've been waiting a long time." Her eyes filled, but no tears fell. They simply glistened like morning dew clinging to tired leaves. "There's a box in that storeroom I never had the nerve to open," she continued. "Leonard sent it right before he disappeared. I couldn't bring myself to face it." Sable blinked, her tail brushing against the dusted wooden planks with the slightest, almost reverent motion. It was not a wag for joy, but a small gesture of understanding, or perhaps of permission. Later that afternoon, after brewing herself a fresh pot of coffee, Agnes finally gathered the courage she had abandoned so many years ago. She walked to the back storage room where, behind stacked crates and rusting syrup dispensers, sat a simple cardboard box sealed with brittle, yellowing tape. Hands trembling, she peeled the tape back. Inside lay photographs, a pocket knife, and a single, unopened letter. The handwriting was Leonard's, unmistakable, steady, and heartbreakingly familiar. Agnes unfolded the letter, her breath slowing with each word. Agnes, if you're reading this, I may not be coming back. But know this, I never left because of you. I've made mistakes I cannot fix, debts I cannot repay. I hope one day you'll forgive me for the silence. Wherever I end up, you'll always be my only home. Love, Lenny. The paper trembled in her hands, and finally, after 6 long decades, the tears came not violent, not desperate, but soft, steady drops that carried a lifetime of waiting. And through it all, Sable lay beneath the diner window, eyes closed, as if she had known exactly what Agnes needed to find, and simply made sure she reached it. That night, as the town slipped into the kind of silence that wraps around you like an old quilt, Agnes whispered into the quiet air. Do you think someone sent her here, Lenny? Or did she just know? I believe some hearts carry maps others cannot see, Victor Malone said softly, his voice steady despite the darkness that had become his constant companion. He stood in his small woodshop in Birch Haven, where the scent of cedar and sawdust still filled the air, even though his own eyes could no longer see the shavings collecting beneath his feet. The workbench before him stretched like an altar to what used to be sandpaper worn thin, clamps frozen in position, and a half-built cabinet that had waited too long for his trembling hands to return. The sunlight outside cut sharp angles through the slatted blinds, creating patterns he could no longer appreciate, but whose warmth still kissed the back of his weathered hands. Victor hadn't always lived in shadow. In fact, for most of his life, he had been known in 3 counties as the man who could coax beauty from wood like a hymn rising out of silence. His fingers had once danced across grain lines like a preacher flipping through a beloved Bible, reverent, sure, and full of patience. But then came the fall, a simple ladder, a simple misstep, and the cruel snap of bone that led to surgeries, then complications, and finally, darkness. At first, people came by. Neighbors, old friends, church members, all offering casseroles, quiet pity, and phrases that sounded kind but left the bitter taste of charity behind. But after a while, the visits grew fewer, the offers stopped, and Victor found himself alone with his tools, his memories, and the half-built cabinet he had promised his late wife, Martha, just before she passed. He tried to finish it once, tracing the wood with his fingertips, counting inches and angles, but every joint felt foreign, every groove uneven. The tools mocked him with their cold, unyielding silence, tools that had once trusted him to give them purpose. And so, for years, the project sat untouched, like grief made solid. Then one afternoon, without warning or invitation, came the dog. Victor first noticed her presence not by sight, but by sound, the gentle tap of paws against old hardwood, careful and deliberate. She didn't announce herself with barks or whines, as many strays might have. Instead, she simply entered as though she had every right to be there. Her breathing was steady, rhythmic, filling the quiet like a soft drumbeat Victor hadn't realized he missed. When he spoke, it was as if to the air itself. Well now, you lost too, girl? The dog didn't answer, of course. But somehow, her silence was the most honest response he'd heard in years. She lay down beside his workbench that evening, resting her head against the leg of the stool, as though she understood the unfinished weight that loomed above her. Victor, guided by some unseen pull, reached out and gently touched the top of her head, feeling the roughness of her fur, the slight heat of life beneath his fingertips. It had been a long time since he'd touched anything living without flinching. As days passed, she returned, always at the same time, always taking her place beneath the unfinished cabinet. Victor found comfort in her quiet company. Where words failed, presence filled the gap. One morning, emboldened by the strange calm she brought, Victor reached again for his tools. Not to build for others. Not to prove he could still master the craft. But simply to try. For Martha, for himself, and now, for the creature who refused to let him sit idle any longer. His hands trembled as he located the edges of the wood, feeling the familiar grooves, the marks he once made with steady fingers. Slowly, methodically, he began fitting the pieces together, relying not on sight, but on memory, on instinct, on the years his hands had trained for moments like this. The chisel met the wood with a soft resistance, and for the first time in years, Victor smiled. Not because it was perfect, but because it was honest. Day by day, the cabinet took shape beneath his hands. And each evening, as the sun dipped below the trees and cast long shadows across the workbench, the dog, whom he'd come to call Sable, remained close, her steady breathing anchoring him in place. When the final panel slid into its groove and locked with a satisfying click, Victor stood back, unsteady, but whole, and let the silence of the shop fill with something new, completion. He rested his hand on the finished cabinet, his thumb tracing the edge as if to reassure himself it was real. "You think she'd have liked it, girl?" he asked, his voice cracking like dry timber. Sable looked up, her ears twitching slightly, her eyes reflecting the slanted light like pools of quiet understanding. That night, for the first time in years, Victor left the shop door open. He brewed a cup of tea, sat on the porch, and whispered toward the stars, as if Martha might hear him. "Did you send her love? Did you send this dog to guide these old hands again?" "I believe some journeys don't start until something calls you back," Emily Carter whispered, her young voice barely louder than the waves breaking softly against the shore. She stood barefoot on the jagged stones of Silverwind Point, where the old lighthouse towered above her like a silent giant that had forgotten how to speak. The sky wore its usual early morning gray, the kind of gray that bleeds into your bones and makes everything feel heavier than it should for a 12-year-old girl. But Emily wasn't afraid of the water, nor the wind, nor the empty lighthouse that most locals had long stopped visiting. She was waiting for something she couldn't name, but somehow knew was coming, or rather, returning. The dog had found her 3 days ago, not in a place people would expect to find lost things, but in the woods behind her grandmother's cabin, where Emily often went when the world grew too loud. The shepherd appeared between the trees like a shadow that didn't belong to anything, calm, steady, and with those eyes that held the weight of a story Emily wasn't old enough to understand. The tag around her neck had no name Emily could read, just worn brass, scratched by years of weather, and a warmth beneath her fur that felt like home. Her father, Captain Daniel Carter, had disappeared at sea when Emily was just 4 years old. The Coast Guard called it a storm, the town called it a tragedy, but Emily always believed it was unfinished. Not unsolved, not a mystery to be cracked like some detective novel, but unfinished, like a song that stops before the last note. She and the dog, whom she now called Sable, because anything that loyal deserved a name, had wandered toward the lighthouse together every morning since. Not because there was anything new to find, but because her heart kept pulling her back to that tower where her father once worked as keeper before returning to sea for the last time. The lighthouse had long been boarded up, its stairwell rusted, its lamp dark, but it still held echoes in its walls, echoes that whispered when the wind came from the east. That morning, Sable nudged open a warped side door Emily had never dared try before. The hinges groaned like a waking giant, but the door gave way, revealing the narrow staircase spiraling up into shadows and dust. Emily hesitated only a moment, her hand gripping Sable's thick fur for balance, then climbed slowly, one creaking step at a time, the dog guiding her with every cautious glance upward. At the top, sunlight spilled through broken panes, painting stripes across the floor like faded prison bars. The beacon itself was long gone, dismantled, sold, or left to rot, but the small keeper's office still held remnants of someone who had once called this place home. And there, tucked beneath a warped floorboard that Sable's paw had scratched free, sat a drawer, no longer attached to any desk, but carefully placed, as though waiting to be found. Emily's breath caught as she reached inside, pulling free a bundle wrapped in oilcloth and tied with string that crumbled in her fingers. Inside was a letter, still sealed. The handwriting on the envelope shook her knees, her father's. Even after all these years, she recognized the sharp angles of his D and the looping tail of his C. With trembling hands, she unfolded the paper, careful not to tear the brittle edges. The ink had faded, but the words reached her clearly. "My dearest Emily, if you're reading this, it means you found the place where I always felt closest to you and your mother. The sea has taken many men, and if it takes me too, know that I never left you in spirit. This lighthouse watched over us, and now perhaps it has watched over you. You are stronger than you know. All my love, Dad." The paper shook in her grasp as tears welled in her eyes. Not the crushing grief of a child who loses, but the quiet, complex release of someone who has finally touched something she never thought she'd hold again. Sable sat beside her, pressing against her leg with a silent warmth that said more than words ever could. As the gulls circled high above the tower, Emily folded the letter gently and pressed it to her chest. She looked down at the old shepherd and smiled through the tears. "Did you know, girl?" she whispered, voice cracking like thin ice. "Did you know he left this for me?" Sable blinked, slow and steady, her breath rising in calm waves, like she had been waiting for this very moment long before Emily ever climbed those stairs. Later that evening, as the sun melted behind the horizon, painting the water with gold and amber, Emily sat beside her grandmother's fireplace, letter safely tucked away in a wooden box her father once carved. The house smelled of old cedar and rain-soaked wool, while the clock ticked with a rhythm that seemed gentler than usual. Her grandmother, Margaret Carter, looked at the dog curled up near the hearth, then at Emily, her voice softer than the crackling fire. "Do you think that dog was looking for you, or was she following someone else's path?" "I think sometimes the path chooses both traveler and guide," Reverend Harold Finch murmured to himself. His words swept gently into the wind, as if meant for no one and everyone all at once. The sun had barely climbed over the tops of the elms that framed the broken chapel in Ashbrook, and yet the soft morning light couldn't hide the years of decay that now clung to the once proud church like ivy that had forgotten how to bloom. The old steeple leaned slightly, as though burdened by the weight of too many prayers left unanswered, while the wooden cross above the roof creaked whenever the breeze shifted with just enough force to remind the structure of its own fragility. Harold stood beneath that cross every morning now, as part of a ritual he neither fully understood nor questioned anymore, his hands gripping the polished head of his cane, while his tired eyes traced invisible patterns across the faded stained glass windows. The chapel had been silent for nearly 20 years, its doors shuttered after tragedy stripped the place of its music, its laughter, and most of all, its purpose. Yet Harold, even in his solitude, returned here daily, as though presence alone could fill the hollow space where hymns once rose to touch the rafters like whispered promises. He had once been the lifeblood of this place. In the years before everything fell apart, his choir had been known throughout 3 counties for their harmonies that could bring both strangers and skeptics to their knees. But that was before the accident, before his son, Matthew, was lost on a rain-slick road after rehearsal one stormy Thursday night. Since then, every note Harold once loved had turned brittle in his throat, every melody soured by the echo of tires skidding on wet asphalt and the scream of twisting metal. He had not sung since. He had not forgiven himself since. And he had not allowed the choir to gather again, believing that silence was the only thing sturdy enough to hold his sorrow without breaking beneath its weight. That morning, though, something was different. The dog had arrived. She came not with noise or commotion, but with the gentle certainty of someone who had simply found her way, as though following coordinates etched into her bones long ago. Her paws left faint impressions in the soft dirt path leading up to the chapel's sagging doors, while her gaze locked on a Harold with an unspoken knowledge that made him shiver despite the morning warmth. Harold squinted, taking a tentative step forward, his cane tapping softly against the cracked stone beneath him. "Now where in God's name did you wander in from, girl?" he whispered. The German shepherd didn't answer, of course, but her presence filled the empty air with a quiet tension, as if she were listening not for commands but for the ache within him. She sat by the rusted iron gate, resting her head on her front paws, waiting like someone who had already heard the ending of the story but was kind enough not to spoil it. For the first time in years, Harold stepped through the heavy doors of the chapel. Dust swirled in shafts of morning light, as though the air itself was surprised to be disturbed. And at the center of the sanctuary, just where Matthew used to stand, sat the old baby grand piano, untouched but intact, like a sealed letter that had never found its reader. Harold stood beside it, his hand hovering over the lid, fingers trembling like a man standing on the edge of a bridge he swore he'd never cross again. He opened it slowly, the faint scent of old varnish and aged strings rising up like a memory released from hibernation. The dog padded softly into the room behind him, her claws clicking rhythmically against the wooden floor, her breath steady and calm. She sat at the foot of the piano bench and stared at Harold, her eyes warm yet insistent, as though gently daring him to try. With a deep, uneven breath, Harold lowered himself onto the bench, his hands hovering over the keys like old friends greeting one another after too long apart. He pressed one note, soft, tentative, uncertain, and the sound rang out, imperfect yet alive, trembling through the empty chamber. Then another note, and another. The melody formed slowly, like dawn pushing back the dark. Without meaning to, Harold found himself playing the hymn Matthew loved most, Nearer, My God, to Thee. His voice, hoarse from years of silence, quietly followed the fragile tune, cracking on the high notes but refusing to stop. The dog remained perfectly still, her head tilted slightly, listening with the kind of reverence only the truly loyal know how to offer. When the final note drifted into stillness, Harold sat frozen, his chest tight with something he hadn't felt in years, not grief, but release. Tears welled, but they no longer stung like they once had. Instead, they felt warm, like rain falling on dry ground that might finally bloom again. That afternoon, Harold unlocked the church doors fully for the first time in decades. The hinges groaned in protest but swung wide, inviting the wind and sun to fill the room with the kind of light it hadn't known since the choir last sang together. The next day, as word spread quietly through Ashbrook, familiar faces returned, older now, with their own sorrows, but drawn back like scattered notes returning to a chorus. One by one, voices rose again within those walls, shaky at first, but growing stronger with each verse, each harmony knitting wounds that had long gone unattended. Sable sat near the front pew every rehearsal, never disruptive, always steady, the silent witness to a broken choir learning how to find its song once more. That evening, Harold sat by the front steps, watching the sun dip low and casting long shadows across the path where Sable now lay beside him. He spoke softly, as if speaking to both the dog and the ghost of his son. "Do you suppose she carries all of our pain with her, Matthew? Or is she simply returning what we've lost?" "I believe she brings what was left behind," Roy Lemons whispered, his voice nearly lost in the vast emptiness of the lake that stretched before him like an endless, patient mirror. The wind barely stirred as the sun bled its early light across Cranesfield Lake, turning the smooth water into a sheet of polished glass that reflected both the beauty of the sky and the weight of the man standing at its edge. Roy had come here before dawn, as he always did lately, walking the same gravel path that crunched beneath his boots like a trail of brittle memories being ground into dust beneath his steps. He was 74 now, though every one of those years felt longer than the one before, as though the hours after his wife passed had stretched themselves thin to punish him for continuing on alone. Jean had been his anchor, the steadying force who kept him afloat after the war, after the lost jobs, after the years of silent dinners when the world grew too heavy to carry between words. Without her, the house was nothing more than four walls containing too much air and too little meaning. Fishing had been their thing, not because either of them particularly loved the sport, but because it gave them long hours to sit beside one another, sharing quiet looks that always seemed to say more than any conversation could. After she died, Roy kept coming back to the lake, pretending for a while that maybe she was still sitting next to him, just beyond the corner of his tired eye. But as the years dragged on, even that soft illusion began to fade, leaving behind nothing but a wide, hollow ache. Lately, however, he hadn't come to fish. He had come to let go. That morning, his old tackle box sat beside him, the same rusted tin box that had carried his lures and lines for over 40 years. Inside, carefully folded, was the letter. A letter he had written not for his children, nor for the handful of friends who still called once or twice a year, but for whoever might one day pull his body from the water. He had planned it out, how he would wade in slowly, the way he used to when setting bait traps along the far edge of the dock. How the cold would creep first into his ankles, then his knees, then wrap itself around his chest like a final, patient embrace. There would be no note left in the house, no phone call made beforehand. Just the empty boat drifting at sunrise, and the silence he thought he deserved. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. She appeared with no fanfare, just before first light, her paws making no sound as they pressed into the damp shoreline behind him. The dog sat down exactly 6 feet behind where Roy stood, her head tilting slightly as if she recognized the weight pressing on his back. Her presence wasn't intrusive or demanding, she simply existed there beside him, filling the air with a quiet pressure that made the lake feel smaller, closer, somehow less willing to swallow him whole. Roy glanced back, his eyes narrowing, not in suspicion, but in strange recognition. He had seen many stray dogs in his life, but there was something different about this one. The way she sat, poised, steady, patient, felt less like an accident and more like appointment. "You lost too, aren't you, girl?" Roy said softly, his voice cracking beneath the strain of years held too tightly. The dog, Sable, blinked once, her breath forming small clouds in the morning chill, and continued her silent vigil. As Roy took a tentative step toward the water, Sable stood and, with quiet confidence, walked over to the tackle box, nudging it gently with her nose. It fell open with a soft metallic click, and something unexpected slipped free from beneath the folded letter, a small, faded envelope Roy hadn't seen in years. His breath caught. With trembling fingers, he reached down and lifted the worn paper, addressed in Jean's delicate handwriting, the very letter she had written for him on their 40th anniversary, tucked into the tackle box the last time they'd fished together. He had forgotten it was even there. The envelope, though weathered, still carried her perfume faintly lavender, with a hint of cedar from their cabin. His eyes burned as he unfolded the fragile paper and read her familiar looping script. Roy, if you ever find yourself out here alone, thinking you don't have the strength to come back home, know this. I have loved you for every hour of every day, and wherever you go, I'll be waiting on the other side, but not yet. Live a little longer for me. Just a little longer. His knees buckled, but Sable pressed against his leg, steadying him as his sobs broke loose, unfiltered and raw like spring floods bursting through thawed earth. He sank to the ground, clutching the letter to his chest as the dog rested her head on his shoulder with the quiet understanding of someone who had seen men fall before and knew when to simply hold them up. The lake, which had moments ago seemed so inviting in its cold finality, now shimmered like something holy, not a grave, but a mirror reflecting the life that still remained inside him. Roy sat there for what felt like hours, the sunrise painting the water gold as Sable kept her silent vigil by his side. When he finally stood, he gathered the tackle box, folded the letter carefully back inside, and whispered through broken breath. Maybe just a little longer, Jean. That night, with his porch light burning for the first time in months, Roy sat outside, watching Sable doze peacefully beneath the wooden swing they both now claimed as home. He looked at her through damp, grateful eyes and whispered, Do you think she knew where to find me? Or do you think someone sent her? I think sometimes we're found before we know we're lost, Caleb Whitaker whispered, though the words barely broke free from his dry, trembling lips, as if even speaking them out loud risked upsetting the fragile stillness he had carefully wrapped around himself. The park at Elmsbury was empty that morning, just as it had been the evening before, with only the soft rustling of early autumn leaves breaking the heavy silence that blanketed every pathway, bench, and empty playground swing. The sun was rising slowly, pressing gold through thinning trees, but Caleb stayed tucked beneath the bench like a small bird hiding beneath thick branches, waiting for the storm that had already come and gone. Caleb had been missing for 2 days now. The flyers posted on telephone poles, the worried voices of search parties, and the hollow desperation in his mother's voice had spread across town like wildfire. But Caleb hadn't been taken, hadn't wandered far, hadn't even truly meant to run away. He had simply slipped through the cracks of grief so deep that adults couldn't see how easily children disappear without moving at all. His sister, Lila, had passed only 6 months earlier. The car accident had come like a thief in the night, taking not only her life but the color from his parents' faces, the warmth from their home, and the voice from his own throat. For Caleb, silence had become safer than speaking, because words now only seemed to lead to sorrow he couldn't fix or carry. He hadn't spoken since the funeral. The park bench had become his quiet fortress, invisible to passing eyes, but still within reach of the last place he remembered feeling safe, when Lila would push him on the swings and laugh like nothing could ever touch them. Then, out of the soft morning fog, the dog arrived. Sable moved without urgency, like she had been walking toward this boy for far longer than the 2 days he had been gone. Her paws disturbed the brittle leaves with a rhythm that neither startled nor intruded, but announced her arrival like a gentle knocking on a long-closed door. When she reached the bench, she paused for a moment, tilting her head to one side, as if weighing what the boy beneath it needed most. Words she could not give, or simply her presence. Without making a sound, she lowered herself beside him, her warm body pressing gently against his back beneath the bench's wooden slats. The heat of her fur reached him like a long-forgotten embrace, familiar and undeserved all at once. Caleb did not move at first, his breath catching sharply as tears swam in his eyes without permission. He expected the dog to leave, as so many others had, but instead, she remained still, her steady breathing synchronizing with his shallow gasps until his chest finally slowed its uneven rhythm. Hours passed this way, the world carrying on above them. Joggers came and went. Parents pushed strollers past without noticing the pair beneath the bench, lost inside their own invisible world. Sable never flinched, never shifted away, never asked anything of him but permission to stay. As night fell, the park emptied once again, and the cool wind returned to claim the open spaces. Caleb, exhausted from holding back the weight inside him for too long, finally slid his hand slowly across the ground until his fingers found the thick, rough fur of Sable's shoulder. The dog didn't move, but her ear twitched slightly, acknowledging the boy's fragile courage without rushing him. And then, without even meaning to, Caleb's voice cracked free from its long imprisonment, so faint it might have gone unnoticed by anyone else. "Lila," he whispered. Then, with another trembling breath, "Stay." It was not a full sentence, not a confession, but it was enough. Enough for Sable, enough for him, enough for the moon above them, which glowed brighter as if to bear silent witness. The next morning, the searchers found them still there, the boy curled beside the dog, sleeping for the first time since he had vanished. His mother, Joan Whitaker, dropped to her knees with a gasp as tears streamed down her face, unable to speak, her hands reaching for her son like she was afraid he might dissolve if she touched him too quickly. Caleb sat up slowly, rubbing his eyes as his gaze settled first on his mother, then on the dog beside him. His hand stayed on Sable's head even as he allowed himself to fall into his mother's embrace. Later that evening, as the sheriff stood quietly at the end of the hospital corridor, he watched Sable sitting by the lobby doors, calm and still, waiting again as though her work here had simply reached its next pause. The sheriff, a man who had seen many strange things over the course of his long years, whispered softly to himself, "Who keeps sending her where she's needed next? I believe she listens to what broken hearts cannot say," Nora Sullivan whispered, her voice barely holding steady as she knelt before the cedar chest that had remained shut for nearly 20 years. The morning air inside the old house in Willow Junction was cool and heavy, filled with the faint scent of lavender sachets long faded, cedarwood aging quietly, and the echoes of conversations that had not been spoken aloud in decades. Sunlight crept through the dusty curtains in thin, deliberate lines, as though hesitant to disturb what lay sleeping in this forgotten room. Nora's hands trembled as she reached for the brass latch, the weight of years pressing firmly against her chest with every inch her fingers moved closer. Beside her stood her husband, Patrick Sullivan, equally still, his face carved with the kind of silent ache that grows in men who spend too many years learning how not to cry. They had come to this moment together, though they had spent far too many years apart, not in distance, but in the kind of grief that builds invisible walls between people who once vowed never to build them. Their daughter, Maggie, had been gone for nearly 2 decades, not from death, but from choice. One argument, one terrible night, one door slammed too hard, and she had vanished into the world beyond, leaving behind no address, no phone number, and only a trail of unanswered letters returned unopened. In time, the sorrow had hardened into silence, and silence into routine, as though pretending she never existed was easier than admitting they no longer knew how to forgive themselves or each other. That was, until Sable arrived. The dog had come without fanfare, as she always seemed to, slipping through the broken gate early one morning and curling herself beneath the wooden swing on the Sullivans' wide front porch, where Maggie had once read books beneath her mother's watchful eye. Neither Nora nor Patrick had spoken when they first noticed her, but something unspoken passed between them, a ripple in the still pond of their long, shared quiet. Sable remained there for days, her calm gaze following them through kitchen windows, through half-open doors, through the hours they spent avoiding one another inside the house. She asked for nothing, but her presence pulled at threads both of them had worked hard to keep tightly knotted. It was Nora who first broke the years of stillness, her voice as fragile as brittle china. "She's waiting for something," she said one evening as they watched the dog from the dining room. Patrick simply nodded, unable, or perhaps unwilling, to challenge the truth he, too, had begun to feel. And then, one morning, Sable led Nora to the attic. The dog had nudged open the old storage door, her nose brushing lightly against a small woven basket where Maggie had once stored her knitting projects. On top of the basket, folded with delicate care, lay a scarf, deep blue with faint silver threads, the very one Maggie had worn the night she left home, her voice hoarse from shouting, her face streaked with tears. Nora's breath hitched, and Patrick, seeing the color drain from her face, hurried to her side, steadying her as though bracing against a tide that had risen too fast. With great care, Nora lifted the scarf, inhaling the faint, impossible trace of her daughter's perfume that clung like a defiant ghost. But beneath the scarf lay something even more unexpected, a sealed envelope, its paper yellowed by time, but the ink unmistakably fresh with her daughter's looping handwriting. To Mom and Dad, if you ever find this. Nora opened the letter, her hand shaking so fiercely that Patrick gently steadied her wrist as she unfolded the page. The words swam before her eyes but found their mark with every breath she drew. I was angry. So angry, I couldn't see straight. But not once did I stop loving you. I never mailed this, because I was too proud. But if you're reading it, maybe that means you still looked for me. I miss you. And I hope one day we find our way back to each other. The silence that followed was no longer heavy. It was soft, hopeful, open. Nora collapsed into Patrick's arms, sobbing freely for the first time in years, her husband holding her as his own tears finally broke free. They were not tears of loss, but of something tenderer, something lighter than the burden they had carried all these years. Sable sat nearby, her head resting gently against Nora's knee, as though anchoring the woman to this long-overdue moment. In the following weeks, life shifted gently in the Sullivan home. Letters were written, not out of desperation, but invitation. Calls were made to old friends who might know where Maggie had gone, and neighbors offered names of people they remembered hearing from long ago. And then one evening, as twilight painted the sky in soft purples and golds, headlights appeared at the end of the long dirt driveway. A woman stepped from the car, hesitant but unmistakable, older, with faint lines at the corners of her eyes, but carrying the same fierce, familiar energy they had never stopped loving. Maggie had come home. There were no grand speeches as she stepped onto the porch, only open arms and quiet sobs as 3 lives stitched themselves slowly back together. And as they stood in that embrace, Sable quietly stepped away, her work in this place complete, her eyes turning gently toward the long road once again. Later that night, as the stars blinked softly overhead, Patrick whispered to the dog as she rested beside the porch swing. Do you think you carry all these stories with you, girl? Or do you leave a piece behind every place you heal? I believe she gathers what others forget to hold, Clara Jensen whispered, her voice barely louder than the soft creak of the old wooden floor beneath her feet. The morning light slipped gently through the smudged windows of Milltown Bakery, filling the empty space with a kind of warmth that felt both familiar and distant, like a song whose melody she could hum but whose lyrics had long since faded. The oven stood cold, their doors slightly ajar, as though waiting for the day their silence would finally be broken again. Clara stood in the center of the bakery she had once filled with the laughter of customers, the rich smell of rising dough, and the steady rhythm of hands kneading stories into every loaf of bread. But those days belonged to another life now, one that seemed to exist only in old photographs and fading conversations with people who had moved on or grown too old to visit. Since her husband, Walter, passed 5 years earlier, Clara had locked the doors more often than she had opened them, convincing herself that some places were better left as monuments than as wounds reopened. Walter had been the heart of this place, the one who taught her that baking wasn't simply a craft but a conversation between hands and flour, between heat and patience, between hearts that beat inside those who shared a meal together. After he died, the recipes they had built together, scribbled on index cards, smudged with butter stains and laughter, had been boxed away, tucked into a drawer she hadn't dared open since. But that morning, something different had pulled her back inside. The dog had come. Without sound or ceremony, Sable had appeared at dawn, sitting calmly outside the bakery's front door as though waiting for a familiar face to unlock a memory long overdue. Her amber eyes held no urgency, only that quiet knowing Clara had begun to recognize as something far greater than chance. When Clara finally opened the door, Sable stepped inside with deliberate grace, her nails clicking gently against the scuffed hardwood, pausing only once to glance back, as if inviting Clara to follow her into the space she had abandoned. The air inside still carried faint traces of cinnamon and yeast, as though the walls themselves remembered how it once felt to rise with life. Clara's hands brushed along the edge of the counter, fingertips tracing grooves worn deep from decades of cutting, rolling, and shaping dough that once fed not only the town but her own soul. Sable led her toward the corner of the shop, where a small, weathered drawer sat beneath a flour-dusted shelf, the drawer she had not opened since Walter's funeral. Her breath caught in her throat as she knelt before it, her hand hovering for a long moment as if seeking permission not from the world, but from the weight inside her chest. With a slow pull, the drawer creaked open, revealing the forgotten treasure within. Stacks of recipe cards, worn and yellowed, greeted her like old friends returning after a long absence. Handwritten notes filled the margins, Walter's looping script teasing her with jokes, adjustments, and tiny hearts drawn in the corners when he thought she wouldn't notice. And tucked between two of the cards was a folded letter, sealed with the same red wax stamp Walter had used when they first opened the bakery so many years ago. Clara's hands trembled as she unfolded the note, her eyes welling as she read his words one more time. My dearest Clara, if you ever find yourself standing before this drawer again, it means you're thinking about walking back into this kitchen. If that day comes, let me say what I would have said if I could have stayed longer. Bake again. Not because the town needs bread, but because you still have more to give. And I love the way you gave. The tears came freely now, not the harsh sobs of fresh grief, but the soft, rolling kind that washed gently over the sharp edges of old pain. Sable sat quietly beside her, resting her head against Clara's leg, offering no words, only presence, which somehow was far more comforting. For the first time in years, Clara stood with a certainty she had not known since the world shifted beneath her feet. She pulled one of the recipes free from the stack, an old family bread Walter had always called morning light, and carried it to the counter. As the sun climbed higher, the scent of yeast and warm dough slowly filled the bakery once more. The ovens hummed like sleeping giants roused from their slumber, and the dough rose beneath her careful hands as though eager to greet the world again. By noon, the first loaves were cooling on wire racks, their golden crust crackling softly as they settled. The smell drifted out into the street, drawing curious neighbors who paused outside, their eyes widening with surprise and nostalgia. And when Clara finally unlocked the front door, a line quietly formed, not just for bread, but for the comfort that only shared memory can bake into every bite. Children returned, grandchildren who had never known the bakery when it lived, and old friends who had missed its heartbeat stepped across the threshold as though stepping back into their own youth. And through it all, Sable remained near the doorway, watching with her steady gaze, as though making sure that what was broken had begun to mend. That night, as the last customer waved goodbye beneath the soft glow of the street lamps, Clara sat on the front step, the empty baskets beside her and Sable resting against her knee. She looked into those deep, patient eyes and asked softly, her voice filled with wonder. Do you think she knows how many of us she's saved? I believe she carries pieces of us all, Sam Holloway whispered, his voice barely cutting through the still, dry air that hung inside the silent studio of Cedar Bluff Radio like an old, forgotten prayer. The dust danced lazily in the slanted beams of morning light, as though reluctant to settle again after having floated undisturbed for so many years inside that hollow building. The station had long since gone silent, its signal lost to newer voices, bigger markets, and changing times, but the room still smelled faintly of warm vacuum tubes, vinyl records, and stale coffee that had once fueled the midnight voices of a small town's lonely hearts. Sam hadn't set foot inside the building for nearly 2 decades. Once, this was his kingdom, a narrow room with faded burgundy carpet, crooked posters on the wall, and a microphone that had captured the dreams, confessions, and heartbreaks of a town that trusted his voice like an old friend sitting beside them in the dark. Night after night, his broadcast had reached farmers in their tractors, truckers crossing empty highways, and insomniacs who needed someone to remind them that they weren't entirely alone beneath the wide Montana sky. But after his son, Michael, died overseas, the music stopped. The laughter that once lived in Sam's voice fell quiet, replaced by hollow pauses and trembling hands that could no longer cue the next song. The station carried on for a while, automated playlists filled the void where his voice once lived, but eventually, even the machines were silenced when the building was sold and shuttered. Sam had walked away that day, locking the door behind him with no plans to return, choosing instead to let the world forget him just as he tried to forget himself. But fate, as it often does, has ways of guiding us back to where our hearts still live. The dog had come first. Sam noticed her one cold morning, sitting on the front steps of the old station like she'd been waiting for the door to open again. Her coat was rough, her eyes steady, and there was something noble in her stillness, not the desperation of a stray, but the quiet patience of a creature that somehow understood waiting was part of the journey. For days she returned, always sitting there, gazing not at Sam directly, but toward the station door, as if gently reminding him that some doors are not meant to remain locked forever. And then one morning, when Sam's own curiosity finally outweighed his grief, he pulled the heavy ring of keys from the back of his closet and drove to the station with trembling hands. The lock resisted, groaning under years of rust, but finally surrendered with a sharp click. The door creaked open to reveal the room frozen in time, a capsule of who he once was, untouched and waiting. The dog, whom Sam had now quietly named Sable, stepped inside first, her paws making soft echoes across the empty tile floor as she led him back toward the heart of the studio. There, resting beneath the old broadcast console, was a cardboard box Sam didn't remember leaving behind. He lowered himself carefully, his knees groaning in protest, and peeled back the lid with cautious fingers. Inside were the reels, old recordings he thought had been erased or lost, each carefully labeled in Michael's handwriting. Not just station logs, but private recordings, messages, dedications, and conversations they had shared back when Michael used to visit the station as a teenager, sometimes staying late into the night, pretending to be his father's co-host, mimicking his voice and laughter. Sam's throat tightened as he carefully loaded one reel onto the player, his fingers remembering the familiar weight and click of each motion, though his vision blurred with tears. The machine whirred softly, and then, like a ghost pulled from the past, his son's voice filled the room. "Hey, Dad, I know you're gonna hear this someday. Maybe when you're feeling low, like you always do when the holidays roll around. Just wanted to say, you're better at this than you think. You make people feel like they matter. And you made me feel that too. If you're hearing this, it means I'm not around to tell you in person. But you should know, you kept me steady. Keep the light on, old man. Somebody out there still needs to hear your voice." The words struck Sam like waves crashing against a dam that had held far too long. He covered his face, shoulders shaking with grief that no longer carried bitterness, only the overwhelming, tender weight of love remembered. When the recording ended, silence returned, not empty, but full, as if the room itself exhaled alongside him. And for the first time in 20 years, Sam sat down behind the microphone. His hands, though older now, found the familiar dials with ease as he flipped the transmitter switch, wondering if anyone out there still tuned to the dead frequency. The old light above the door flickered, then steadied on air. Sam took a long breath, his voice deep but steady, and leaned into the mic. "Good evening, Cedar Bluff. This is Sam Holloway back again. I don't know who's listening tonight, but maybe that was never really the point. Sometimes, we just need to know someone's still here." Outside the glass booth, Sable lay curled beneath the window, her eyes closing gently as if satisfied that this, too, had been set right. Later that evening, as the signal drifted across the darkened hills, Sam sat quietly beside Sable under the pale glow of the moonlight. His voice, no longer on the radio, now barely more than a whisper. "Do you think she chooses us?" Sam asked, stroking her thick fur with grateful hands. "Or does something else send her, like a hand guiding her down these old, forgotten roads?" "I believe she returns where the circle once began," Miriam Vale whispered, her voice brittle but steady, as she stood beneath the towering remains of the old blackened oak. The morning in Pine Hollow was heavy with that peculiar stillness that only arrives when something long unfinished finally drifts toward its rightful ending. The branches of the oak reached upward like the thin, twisted fingers of an old man praying skyward, not for mercy, but for peace that had taken its time arriving. The farmhouse that once stood proudly beside that tree was gone now, nothing remained but the blackened foundation, faint outlines of where windows used to breathe in sunlight, and the charred skeleton of a home that had carried more than one family's hopes within its walls. Fire had taken it years ago, quickly, violently, one of those merciless blazes that begins with nothing more than a spark but leaves behind a silence that echoes louder than any flame. And yet, as often happens with places tied tightly to souls, the ground beneath the oak still pulsed with a strange kind of life, like memory clinging stubbornly to earth that refused to forget. Sable stood once more at this final place, her breathing shallow now, her steps slow, each movement carrying the weight of miles traveled not for herself, but for others who could not finish their own journeys without her guidance. Her muzzle, once proud and sharply defined, had softened with streaks of silver. Her eyes, though dimmer, still glimmered with that familiar quiet knowing that had carried her across so many miles and so many hearts. Miriam watched her carefully, her hand resting gently against the tree's scorched bark, as misting not from grief but from something much older, something like reverence. Years earlier, Miriam had watched from her own porch when the flames consumed the Brooks house, her heart pounding as fire crews arrived too late to save the structure. Inside that home had lived Calvin Brooks, a man known throughout Pine Hollow for his quiet kindness, and his boy, the foster child he had fought for, loved fiercely, and promised to protect. The boy's name had been Evan. Calvin had died that night, trapped beneath falling beams as he tried to pull furniture away from the flames to clear a path for the boy to escape. But the child, Evan, had been carried out, not by human hands, but by a German shepherd that neighbors would later call a miracle in fur. The newspapers never mentioned her name. Most people simply called her the shepherd. But Miriam had seen. She had watched as Sable dragged the unconscious boy across the field, her own body blistered from the heat, refusing to stop until she laid him gently in the grass, beyond the fire's reach. What happened afterward was the way these stories often go. Evan, too young to understand but old enough to feel the loss, was placed into the state's care, bounced between foster homes like a fragile package passed from hand to hand. Each one never quite able to hold him long enough for the bruises to fade. Sable had vanished soon after, slipping away into the night as though pulled by a purpose no one else could see. And now, years later, she had returned. Miriam glanced up the winding dirt road as a modest car pulled into view, kicking up small clouds of dust that hung in the early light like spirits not yet willing to settle. The car door opened slowly, and from it stepped a young boy, no longer the small child carried from the flames, but a quiet, cautious teenager whose eyes still carried the shadows of places he had wandered through. Evan stood motionless for a long moment, his gaze traveling from the ruins of the house to the dog resting beneath the oak's tired branches. Though years had passed, some connections lived beneath the skin, deeper than memory, and his breath caught as recognition bloomed inside him like an old song suddenly remembered. He walked forward, not fast, not slow, each step heavy with the weight of years he had never fully understood, yet always carried. When he reached Sable, he knelt, his hand hovering for a moment before gently resting upon her side, feeling the frailty beneath the coarse fur that had once seemed so invincible. Sable lifted her head weakly, her gaze locking on to his with the last of her great strength. No words passed between them, for none were needed. Tears filled Evan's eyes, blurring the lines of her face, but he smiled softly, not with joy, not with sorrow, but with the pure, simple gratitude of someone finally found again after being lost for far too long. "You came back for me," he whispered, his voice trembling as it broke free of years buried beneath silence. Sable's tail gave the faintest, almost imperceptible flick against the dirt, a final confirmation that needed no further explanation. As the sun climbed higher, its rays cut through the thinning branches of the oak, casting soft beams of light around them like a quiet benediction. Miriam stepped back, her own heart swelling as she watched a chapter she never thought would close finally find its way to stillness. By evening, Evan sat beneath the oak with Sable resting her head in his lap, her breaths now shallow and slow, but peaceful in a way that spoke of a circle completed. As twilight dipped the sky into shades of indigo, Miriam whispered softly from the porch, as much to herself as to the stars blinking into view. "Do you think she knew all along? Or she was always meant to end?" And from where Evan sat, his voice carried back through the night, warm and sure. "She was always bringing us home."